Who raised you more, your parents, your grandparents, or someone else?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? Because if you have ever spent years proving you are dependable while the people closest to you quietly drain your time, your money, and your patience, you already know the feeling I had when I looked at 4 empty chairs with my last name taped to them and realized that no one who had promised to be there had bothered to show. And in that moment, I understood that if I kept waiting for polite explanations and second chances, then I would be right back where I had always been, carrying the bill, carrying the guilt, and carrying the story for people who never carried me. I was standing in a hallway that smelled like coffee and stress, the kind of place where local news makes everything look cleaner than it is, and the producer, a decent guy named Jake who had double-checked the guest list twice, glanced at the chairs, glanced at me, and said we were live in about 30 seconds, which felt like a dare and a rescue at the same time, because I could either swallow the humiliation and smile through it, or I could tell the truth in a single sentence and let the chips fall where they were always going to fall anyway. And while my chest felt tight, my mind was perfectly clear in that practical way it gets when I have run out of reasons to keep excusing other people's choices. The segment started with the usual patter about small business impact and community mentorship, and I answered the questions the way I always do, straightforward and steady, because I earned this invitation with years of showing up, training people who had been written off, and building a program that works without fanfare. And when the host tossed me that open-ended closer that stations love, the one where you are supposed to thank your supporters and dab your eyes, I felt something unclench. And I looked straight into the camera lens and said, to the people who were not proud, do not text me now. And I did not raise my voice, I did not explain, and I did not soften the edges for anyone who might get uncomfortable. Because the sentence was not a performance, it was a boundary stamped in plain language. There was a breath of silence that tasted like freedom, and then the segment wrapped, and the crew did that awkward shuffle people do when they do not know if they should hug you or pretend they did not hear what they just heard. And I thanked Jake for keeping the camera steady, picked up my bag, and walked into the green room where my phone was face down on the table next to a paper cup that still had my name misspelled, and I thought about how many times I had set reminders to send money, titled "Just Until Things Stabilize," how many times I had covered the family phone plan because it was cheaper that way, how many times I had believed a weekend would be enough to reset a pattern that was not a phase, but a comfortable system for everyone but me. I flipped the phone over and saw nothing yet, which felt honest, because for once the silence matched the behavior, and before the flood could start I opened the carrier app, and I will not pretend it did not make my hands shake. But I scrolled to the linked lines that were never paid on time unless I nagged, and I tapped through the screens that try to make you second-guess yourself, and I canceled every line that did not belong to me, and when the confirmation code arrived I entered it with the same calm I used to send invoices. Then I opened my banking app, found the automatic transfer labeled temporary bridge, and I turned it off with a quiet click that somehow sounded louder than the applause had felt. And I screenshotted every confirmation, because I have learned that neat paperwork is better than long speeches when the backpedaling begins. I know what you might be thinking, that this is harsh, that I could have waited a day for explanations, that maybe traffic or a headache or a forgotten alarm derailed the plans, and I hear you, I do, because I used to talk to myself that way too. Except you cannot mistake a pattern when you are the one writing the checks and smoothing the stories and filling chairs for people who care more about optics than about effort, and I had the confirmations from earlier in the week when they each said they would be there, and I had the memory of a dozen other big days where something somehow came up, and I had the arithmetic that never lies about who pays and who benefits. When I left the building, the afternoon felt ordinary in that boring way life does when the truth finally gets said out loud, and I am not going to decorate the moment with drama because it did not need it. All it needed was the discipline to follow through without apologizing for my own boundaries, and as I walked toward my car, the notification tone hit once and then again, the slot machine sound of consequences arriving on schedule. And the first missed call flashed from Mom, the second from Tyler, the third from Dad, and then a number that I did not recognize, which I assumed was someone's girlfriend or a borrowed phone because mine had finally stopped subsidizing the habit. I let each call roll to voicemail because I know how this works, and if you have ever been the fixer in your family you know it too. where apologies arrive wrapped in conditions like you went too far or you know how he gets or can we just start fresh if you undo that one thing. And I decided that before anyone gets a conversation, they will get a receipt. And before anyone gets a seat at my table again, they will bring their own chair. And before anyone uses my name to look responsible, they will have to be responsible with their own name first. I sat in the driver's seat, took one long breath, and messaged the only 3 people who have never asked me to shrink so they could feel bigger, the ones who actually showed up without being fed a script. And I told them the clip would probably travel and I might need help ignoring the noise, and I promised myself that the next time I pay for someone else's choices it will be because I chose generosity, not because I was tricked into it by guilt. And as the missed calls stacked into double digits and the text bubbles started forming little storms on the screen, I said out loud, "Okay, let us see who keeps calling when it costs them." And I turned the key and drove away while the phone buzzed against the cup holder like an insect that just realized the window is closed. By the time the clip settled into the rhythm of a workday feed and started hopping from one group chat to another, like it had its own calendar, the people who actually knew how many nights I had stayed up fixing other people's messes began to surface with messages that did not need rehearsing because they came from the ones who had stood next to me when no one was looking. And it felt strangely simple to respond with gratitude that did not beg for approval or over-explain the obvious. So when the chamber sent a polite note inviting me to a small celebration and hinted that they would love to acknowledge the training program that kept graduates employed longer than a probation period, I said yes, and then did the thing that used to make me feel disloyal, which was to redraw the seating chart in my head and on paper so that the chairs closest to me would belong to people who had earned the view. I opened the guest list and stared at the block of 4 that had been reserved out of habit, as if blood alone bought real estate at my table, and I replaced those names with Maria, the mentor who taught me to keep a folder of proofs instead of a folder of excuses, with Keisha, the intern who turned into a manager because she listened and then learned and then led, with Jamal, the night shift neighbor who watched my dog when sessions ran long, and with Mrs. Howard, the retired teacher who showed up at our practice interviews with more homework than anyone asked for, and I will not pretend the swap did not make my stomach lurch, yet the lurch felt like a muscle waking up rather than a warning to back down. And when I posted a single calm line that said, "I am grateful for those who were present and I keep receipts," I did not tag, I did not subpost, I did not point a finger, because the point had already been made by absence, and my job now was to organize presence. The celebration itself was the kind of modest community thing that gets derailed when people chase speeches over substance, but I kept it tight and useful, and when I took the mic I did not perform a victory lap. I did what I told myself I would do if I ever had the chance, which was to lay out a small stipend program in my company's name for the next round of trainees who could not afford the course fee up front, funded by the money I would no longer watch disappear into family plans and emergency transfers that never ended, and the logic felt clean in my mouth, because every dollar I had stopped bleeding now had a job that matched my values. And the applause that followed was not the sticky kind that requires you to hold hands with people who never carried you. It was the dry, practical kind that says do more of this and less of the other. And the look on Maria's face when I asked her to give the toast told me I was not crazy for thinking loyalty should travel in both directions. I learned a long time ago that a woman who sets a rule can sound mean to people who were counting on her not to have one, so I kept my voice level and my smile small. And while the room leaned in to hear Maria talk about work that counts and the way dignity grows in quiet routines, I noticed the door crack and a familiar silhouette slide through with a bouquet raised like a hall pass. And every muscle in my back knew it was Tyler before my brain wrote his name, because entitlement has its own gait, the breezy saunter of a man certain he will be forgiven first and questioned later, and he threaded between tables like a guest of honor even though his name was nowhere. And when he kissed the air near my cheek and said traffic was a nightmare, which I took as comedy because the venue was 10 minutes from his apartment, he leaned close enough that I could smell the hurry on him and whispered that we needed to talk about the card. And he said the word card the way a person says the word, whether casual and meaningless, as if we both knew this was a small aside that I would fix out of habit as soon as the cake was sliced. In another year, I might have put a hand on his shoulder and walked him outside to whisper solutions like a good sister who knows the playbook, a quick transfer here, a call to the bank there. A promise to keep it between us so the future in-laws never wondered why the payments always arrived at the last possible moment. But that version of me had already been retired by the 4 empty chairs, and the way my sentence on live television had reset the math, so I did not follow him out. I did not ask what he meant, and instead I let Maria finish her toast while I took a slow sip of water and watched Tyler grin and wave to people who did not invite him, and I waited for the part of my nervous system that usually jumps up to pick up the pieces. And when it stayed seated, I realized the program I had launched 5 minutes earlier was already doing its quiet job, which was to turn my old leakage into something that fed strangers who would become my people. After the toast, when the room turned to casual chatter and plates that never stay full, I walked over to the coordinator to finalize a date for the next cohort and confirmed that the stipends would be tracked with simple rules and posted publicly so no one had to guess where the money went. And out of the corner of my eye, I saw Tyler weaving back with that grin people use when they think a smile erases a bill, and he murmured again that it was about the card and that it would be quick and painless if I could just approve one thing while he sorted the rest, because it would help his limit, and it would not touch my credit at all. And even though I did not have the details yet, I felt the cold outline of a problem that had probably been growing roots under my feet for months. Because cards and addresses and limits do not appear in polite whispers unless someone has already treated your name like a tool. I told him we would not be discussing anything in a crowded room and that if there was paperwork with my name on it, he could send me copies by email because I do not authorize handshakes or hallway promises anymore. And he tried to laugh it off as if I were putting on a show for my new friends, and I met his smile with a look I reserve for contracts, not cousins. And I watched his face do the tiny flicker people get when they realize the old script will not run on the new software, and he backed off with a shrug that said we would circle back, and I let him drift because I had no intention of circling anything without documents. When I finally stepped outside, the message queue pinged with a string of relatives who had discovered their phones no longer lived on my account and were suddenly very interested in my well-being, which told me the natural consequences had reached the right audience. And as I scrolled past the mix of guilt and nostalgia like it was a clearance rack, an email from the credit monitoring service surfaced with a subject line that made my shoulders lock in place, something about a new inquiry tied to an address I did not recognize even though the street looked eerily close to mine, and I stared at the preview while the memory of Tyler's casual card floated up beside it, and I felt the old reflex to pretend I had misread the signs. Then I shut it down. Because if this was what I thought it was, I would not settle it with a phone call or a favor. I would settle it with signatures and a paper trail that arrived where it would be noticed most, which meant I needed an attorney in the morning. And a courier with a good sense of timing, and, while the car unlocked and the night air felt like an unasked question, I said to myself that before anyone draped their arm around my shoulders and said we are family, they would learn how memory works when it is written down. And from the corner of the lot I saw Tyler on his phone gesturing in a way that always used to pull me in, and I turned away because I already knew the only thing I needed to know tonight, which was that a mystery card had my name somewhere near it, and I intended to find out where. The next morning started with a kind of stubborn clarity that I only get when the polite story has finally run out of pages, and instead of pacing my kitchen and drafting imaginary speeches to people who prefer chaos to accountability, I booked the first open slot with an attorney who came recommended by a former client precisely because she is allergic to drama and collects forms the way other people collect trophies. So when I sat across from Ava Ross and slid my folder of screenshots, auto transfer confirmations, and the credit alert email across the table, she did not ask me to lower my voice or calm down or be patient for the sake of optics. She skimmed the documents with the steady focus of someone who believes math more than memories and said we would pull my full report while we were sitting there, and we would print whatever showed up, mark it, and decide which items deserved a phone call and which items deserved a courier who enjoys wearing a suit to daytime events. The report loaded with the indifferent speed of a machine that does not care how your heart is doing, and as lines formed into rows that formed into patterns, Ava tapped a pen next to an account with my name listed as an alternate contact for a truck note that I had never driven and a department store card that I had never used. And while the words alternate contact do not sound like much, Ava explained that it is the kind of casual invitation that collections love because it gives them a permissible number to dial when payments vanish. It implicates you emotionally without binding you legally, and it keeps you tied to someone else's chaos without the courtesy of a signature you can dispute. And then she pointed to a small business card opened 3 months back with a mailing address suspiciously close to mine, which meant someone used the shared hall mailbox or a mistyped apartment number to build a paper trail that looked almost like me. And she sat back with a patient expression that carried no judgment at all as she asked if I had a relative who might think of my name as a resource to be borrowed in emergencies that never really end. Old me would have softened the edges and talked about phases and stress and how he is just under pressure to look like a provider even though the calendar keeps proving otherwise, but new me had already practiced telling the truth without adjectives, so I said yes. My brother has a talent for treating other people's stability like a public utility, and Ava nodded and said that we would draft identity theft affidavits where appropriate and dispute anything that touched my credit without consent. We would add a freeze long enough to starve the next bright idea, and we would send a formal demand to remove my name from any account that used me as a safety net or as a return address. And when I admitted that part of me wanted to handle this quietly because I knew where he was going to be that afternoon and I did not want to ruin his engagement tasting, Ava gave me the kind of look that says this is not about humiliation. This is about sequence, and that the fastest way to stop being a character in someone else's improvisation is to put paper between you and their story, stamped, dated, and delivered in a place where excuses sound small. We drafted the letters with the unglamorous precision that makes bureaucrats smile, filled in dates, cited statutes, attached copies of the entries, and queued them for a same-day courier whose card literally says we deliver consequences. And while Ava printed the packets in triplicate, she asked if I wanted to include a personal note asking him to call me, and I said no because nothing good has ever started with me softening a boundary I finally had the courage to set, and then she asked if I wanted to be present when the papers arrived, and I said absolutely not because I have no interest in the theater. I am only interested in the outcome, which is my name detached from anything it never agreed to touch, and my phone no longer ringing with someone else's obligations. On my way out, as if the universe wanted to punctuate the decision with a flourish I did not request, my phone buzzed with a voicemail from a blocked number that turned out to be my mother performing her favorite duet of disappointment and directive, telling me that I had gone too far, that family matters should not be aired in public even when they have been funded in private, that Tyler is under a lot of stress with the wedding and appearances matter right now, and that we are going to church on Sunday where I will apologize for the confusion, and then we will look at the bills together like a team, and she ended with an instruction to pick up when she called back, because I know better than to make people worry. Which is a sentence I have heard since I was a teenager, and somehow still sparks a tiny ember of shame even though my adult brain knows exactly how the game is played. I did not call her back, not because I wanted to escalate anything but because escalating is what happens when you keep pretending a circle is a line. And the only straight line I wanted that day was the path from my current credit score to a future where my name rings only when I choose, so I drove to the office, put my head down, sent invoices, confirmed tomorrow's training schedule, and waited for Ava's 2-word text that read papers served, which landed in the early afternoon with a detail I had not asked for but appreciated anyway, that the courier had delivered the envelope to Tyler at the tasting while he stood between a mother-in-law with a spreadsheet and a wedding planner with a binder, that the chef paused mid-sauce while the future family watched him read the first page, and that my name never appeared in his mouth while his face made the complicated math of what happens when the reliable sister retires. An hour later, as if the timing had been booked by a producer who loves a callback, an email from the station popped up with the subject line follow-up segment and a note from Jake saying that viewers had written in about boundaries and family pressure and that they wanted me back for a short conversation on air about how to support people without turning them into a wallet with legs, and before I could decide if I would say yes, my phone started ringing again with my mother's number now unblocked. And while it vibrated across the desk like a trapped insect, I let it go to voicemail, because if there is one lesson I am finally willing to practice, it is that silence is not cruelty when the other option is walking back into a burning room with a glass of water. And as the ring ended and the red badge lit up, I pressed play and heard the warning dressed as love. The part where she said, "We will fix this on Sunday. You will not embarrass this family again," and my mouth formed the answer before my mind had finished the thought that the next time she wanted a plan she could call Ava, because from here on out, signatures would do the talking. By the time Sunday rolled around, the whispers had already moved faster than any sermon. And I knew before I even set foot outside my apartment that the story being told about me in the church lobby and in the cousins' text threads was not the story of 4 empty chairs or one woman finally drawing a line, but a carefully re-edited version where I had betrayed my family for attention, embarrassed my brother in front of people who barely knew him, and proven that money had made me cold, which would have been laughable if it did not sting in the precise way that only a half-truth can. Because it was easier for everyone to digest the idea that I had turned arrogant than to sit with the possibility that I had simply grown tired of being the dependable backdrop against which everyone else painted their chaos. I had promised myself that I would not go to that service and play the role of the daughter who lowers her eyes and folds into silence, yet I also knew that letting the story grow unchecked was not strength, it was surrender. And so I decided to do the only thing that makes gossip shrink, which is to replace it with something verifiable, something boring, something that cannot be twisted into a parable, and that meant building a single-page timeline of every transfer, every payment, every phone line, every time my bank account had been the quiet support beam holding up a house that insisted on pretending it was self-built. It was not a manifesto, not a plea for sympathy, not even a revenge note. It was a list with dates, amounts, and short notes like truck down payment, cell phone bill for 4, emergency dental, and wedding deposit advance. Each line signed with my initials so no one could claim I had doctored the record later, and when I finished I printed a handful of copies, folded them neatly into envelopes, and wrote the names of the relatives who actually mattered to me. Not the ones who treated me like a vending machine, but the aunt who once covered my rent when I was 22, the cousin who worked 2 jobs and never asked for a dime, and yes, the pastor, because he had hinted with his kind but loaded smile that reconciliation was the Christian thing to do, and I figured if he was going to shepherd me, he might as well have the map. I did not blast it across social media. I did not hand it out like flyers. I simply sent the envelopes privately, with no commentary other than, "For your records," and then I called Jake at the station and said, "If you want me back for a segment, I will do it, but only under my conditions, which are that there will be no ambush guests, no melodramatic music, no pre-cut footage of family photos. We will sit down, we will talk about boundaries, and we will leave the names out of it, because this is not about revenge. This is about teaching people that support is not a feeling you describe at parties. It is a bill you sometimes cover, and if you never covered it, you do not get to brag about your loyalty." When the day of the taping came, I walked into the studio without shaking, which surprised me, and Jake gave me a nod that said he understood the weight of what I had agreed to, and the host asked me questions that were broad enough to let me control the frame. And when she said, "Lauren, what would you tell people who feel abandoned by their families in big moments?" I did not cry, I did not crack, I simply held up the one-page timeline, pointed to a single line that said, "Auto transfer monthly, 5 years," and I said, "This is what support looked like when I did not have it." And I am no longer ashamed to say that silence is not neutral. Silence is a choice that leaves someone else holding the weight, and then I let the pause hang long enough for the cameras to capture it, and I knew the moment had landed when the host looked down at her notes. Suddenly uncomfortable, because the truth was heavier than any segue she had prepared. Afterward, when the segment aired and circulated, I did not get a tidal wave of public sympathy, which I never wanted anyway. But I did get 3 new contracts from companies who said they admired the clarity and wanted someone with that kind of discipline to train their teams. And I got quiet nods from people in the grocery store who said nothing but looked at me like they recognized the courage it takes to name what has been siphoned from you for years. And I thought to myself that this is How reputations are rebuilt, not with spin or shouting, but with receipts, dull, undeniable, and lined up like bricks in a wall. And of course, just when I thought I had bought myself a stretch of silence, my receptionist called my office line in the late afternoon and said, "Lauren, your parents are in the lobby with a letter, and they say it is urgent." And when I asked her to read the first sentence aloud, she said, "It talks about a fresh start and the importance of family unity, but it never uses the word sorry." And I almost laughed because if you have ever been the peacekeeper in your family, you know that a fresh start is just a coded invitation to erase the ledger and pretend the balance is even. And as I sat at my desk with contracts stacked neatly in front of me, I told her not to send them away, because I wanted them to sit there and wait while I finished something important. And in that pause, I felt the strangest calm, because for once it was not me waiting on them, it was them waiting on me. And I already knew I was not walking into that lobby until I had decided how the next chapter would be written and whether they would be characters in it at all. By the time I decided to sit across from my parents one final time, the story had already grown bigger than the family could shrink it, because the clip from the second interview had been pushed out by the station as a segment about boundaries in business and life, and while the words were mine, the framing made it clear to anyone watching that this was not a meltdown but a plan. Not an impulsive swipe at relatives, but a deliberate line drawn by a woman who had reached her limit. And so when Mom and Dad walked into the boardroom I had rented for the meeting, carrying that carefully typed letter that asked for a fresh start without ever daring to put the word sorry on paper, I knew before they sat down that this would not be about reconciliation in the sense they imagined, but about terms, signatures, and the end of a long unpaid bill. I had arranged the table like a presentation, not because I wanted theatrics, but because clarity is best delivered in writing, so in front of me were 3 folders. The first was a neat packet containing copies of every transfer, every payment, and every monthly bleed I had covered, lined up by year and color-coded so no one could claim confusion. The second was a proposed repayment schedule drafted by Ava, not punitive, not aggressive, but structured enough that Tyler could not wiggle through it with half promises. And the third was a contract for a community partnership naming Maria, my mentor, as the face of a new training program expansion, which I had chosen deliberately as a way of making clear that the seats I used to reserve for family had been reassigned permanently to those who had earned them through loyalty and effort rather than through guilt and obligation. When they sat, Dad cleared his throat in that way men do when they are about to offer a speech that sounds conciliatory but is actually a negotiation, and he started talking about the importance of moving forward, about the mistakes everyone makes, about how families should not air problems in public, and I let him finish without interrupting because there was nothing in his tone that suggested he had come to own the choices that brought us here. He had come to minimize, to suggest symmetry where there was only imbalance, and I knew that the only language that would matter was the language of paper and consequence. I slid the first folder across the table and asked them to read, not because I thought the numbers would shock them, but because I wanted them to sit with the physical weight of the receipts rather than the convenient fog of selective memory. And when Mom frowned and said that some of those transfers had been voluntary and others had been temporary, I answered evenly that voluntary does not mean invisible, temporary does not mean unpaid, and generosity does not erase the fact that every dollar has an owner, and for too long that owner had been me. Then I slid the second folder, the repayment schedule, and I explained that I was not demanding a lump sum, I was not threatening court, I was simply requiring that Tyler's obligations stop living in my shadow and start living on paper where they belonged. And if they wanted me to even consider the idea of a fresh start, it would begin with his compliance, not my forgiveness, because forgiveness is cheap without evidence of change, and I had given away too many second chances to keep pretending they counted as love. Finally, I placed the third folder on the table, the one with Maria's name on it, and I told them calmly that this was the partnership I had chosen to honor with my company's expansion, that the chairs at my table now went to people who showed up, and that if they wanted to know what loyalty looks like, they could study her record instead of rewriting mine, because this was not symbolic, this was structural, and the message had already gone out with the station's push alert announcing the segment where I had thanked the people who did not clap because their silence had made room for new voices, and by the time they had read those words on their phones, the community already understood the shift better than my parents did sitting across from me now. Mom's face tightened in that way it does when she wants to argue but knows the evidence is too heavy to lift, and Dad tapped the edge of the repayment schedule with his finger like he might find a loophole hiding in the margins, but I did not fill the silence. I simply let it stretch, because for the first time in my life I understood that I did not need their approval. I only needed my own consistency, and while they exchanged glances that begged for me to soften, I stayed steady, because softening is what had built the entire debt in the first place. When the meeting ended, not with a handshake but with them gathering their folders and promising to look this over, I stood, collected my bag, and walked toward the door without asking if they wanted to follow. Because the point of this conversation had never been reconciliation, it had been transfer of ownership. Ownership of debt, ownership of silence, ownership of who I allowed in my orbit. And as I pushed open the door, I felt something that was not triumph or even relief, but a kind of spaciousness. The feeling you get when a weight you did not realize was permanent finally shifts off your back. That evening, my phone lit up again with missed calls, one from Tyler's fiancé, another from Mom, and yet another from a cousin trying to play peacemaker, and I watched them stack like a deck of cards I no longer wanted to shuffle. And instead of answering, I sent one text to the family thread, short enough to be sharp but long enough to be final. When there is a signed plan on paper, Ava has my address, and then I archived the chat, moved the new group with Maria, Keisha, Jamal, and Mrs. Howard to my favorites, and set the phone down without a single pang of guilt, because for the first time in years I was not waiting for them to change. I was watching myself change, and that, I realized, was the only family choice that had ever been mine to make.